We've always had phenomenal listener support on this show since day one, but I have to say that recently I have been taken aback by the consistency of mentions, customer mentions of this show on their oil slips, emails, phone calls. It feels as concentrated as it's ever been. Our listener response, our listener interaction, it's never been better. And I just wanted to open the show by saying how much I appreciate that, how much my co-producer Josh appreciates that, and everyone in the building as well. This show is something that every now and again, like last episode, I opened by talking about, my confidence in the longevity of the concept coming from how our customers have interacted with the oil analysis side. I knew that there would be support for a podcast as well, but even so, I can't help but be taken aback and impressed by the consistency that we have among our listeners. So thank you so much. This is your host, Blackstone Joe, and welcome to another episode of Slick Talk. Now that the warm welcome's out of the way, it's time for me to be the parent in the room and tell you what to do and not to do in regards to contamination. This is do's and don'ts, but with a special focus on coolant, fuel, and excess dirt. What to do or not to do if we either identify these things or raise the possibility of these contaminants being present. There's a lot to love about the Blackstone Oil Report, and one of those aspects that I particularly enjoy is how we do not simply lump certain elements together and only mention one possible source for them. We acknowledge that there is a variety of explanations for certain elements, and that applies to the coolant markers. If you're a longtime listener of this show, you know that potassium and sodium are indicative of coolant. However, sodium can be additive in gasoline engine oil, so it's important to acknowledge your brand or blend, and potassium can be an ingredient in certain additives. So here are your do's and don'ts if we either raise the possibility of coolant being present or straight up call out coolant based on the report as a whole. Is this a diesel engine, in which case there should never be sodium at a high level? Or is this a diesel engine where there is potassium, but possibly from Revex arch oil, hence the reason we put, say, a question mark down instead of marking a sample positive? What should you do? What should you not do? Well, let's say if we identify coolant and we say it's there and there's no other possible explanation for elements like potassium and sodium. Here's what you should be doing. You should be watching for coolant loss. You should consider a pressure test of the cooling system if you doubt the fact that there is a leak. Now, keep in mind that we detect coolant at very small levels, so we can identify a leak well before you might notice it on your end. But just because you're not either noticing coolant loss or you're not identifying it right away with a pressure test doesn't mean it's not there. But if we do call it out, and if we're particularly cautionary about it, then coolant loss, a pressure test, these can be ways to detect it on your end as well. And hopefully you're able to manage it or make repairs. So here is something you do not want to do. The first don't is you do not want to extend your oil change interval when coolant contamination is present. As that coolant builds up in the crankcase, it stops the oil from being able to do its job of clean and lubricate the engine, and it will cause the oil to oxidize quicker than it would otherwise. Those solids will turn the oil abrasive. Bad news all around, especially when it comes to wear metals. So do not extend your oil change interval if coolant contamination is present. Really, that's just a good rule of thumb. If we identify a straight up concern, not the possibility of a concern, but a straight up, this engine is wearing heavily, there is contamination, don't run longer. That's a good rule of thumb. You want to monitor how this engine is doing, and to keep a close eye, you can do that by checking back either on shorter intervals or at least keeping your oil change interval consistent. Another don't is don't add an additive that can mask coolant if you're in the process of dealing with either the possibility of a leak, or you want to know, hey, I recently repaired a leak and I want to see how things are progressing. If you dump in, let's say, Arch Oil or Revex or Turbomax, now these are harmless additives, but they contain potassium, and that is one of our markers for coolant. So it can keep us from determining, say, if you made repairs, how well things are going. Sure, we can look at other markers, other elements to get a feel for it, but it does cloud the picture when you have potassium from additive, and then you also have potassium from coolant, and you, the owner, understandably are looking for clarity, and we might not be able to give you the clarity that you seek if there are additives clouding the markers for coolant. So don't add a product that could mask contamination, especially if it's the sort of contamination that you're worried about. And lastly, on the note of coolant, I would say it's a good idea to keep your oil consistent. A couple things, and this is no fault of the customer, especially if you're not accustomed to looking at thousands of oil samples like so many of us are in the building. I don't blame you for not understanding this point right away, but it's an important one. Consider asking the analyst, giving us a call before you switch brands or blends. If the brand you want to switch to uses sodium, consider asking us that if you're in the situation of either having a coolant leak, or you're trying to monitor progress after repairs, or maybe we point out the possibility because let's say you go from Mobil 1, an oil that does not use sodium. Now, remember, this is in the context of gasoline engines because diesel engine oils don't use sodium. So let's say we have raised the possibility of coolant, or we've straight up found a leak. You're running Mobil 1, a good product in this case because it doesn't use sodium. So we know that a high sodium level is indicative of coolant. And then all of a sudden you make a switch to, let's say, Valvoline. Now, right away, Valvoline is a good oil. I'm not saying it's an oil you should avoid, but a lot of Valvoline products use sodium. So it might be a good product brand blend to stay away from if you're in the situation where you're trying to monitor sodium and what's contamination and what's oil additive. It's something you want to consider. Now, of course, if you're in a situation where, you need to buy the oil that's cheap, or you have limited options, it's still a good product. Running it's not going to be an issue. Just keep in mind it can cloud our ability to dissect, all right, what is contamination? What's oil additive? Of course, we know what a typical additive level is, but when you're dealing with coolant, it's a good thing. It's a good idea to narrow the possibilities, narrow that down as much as possible. And that way we can give you as much clarity on what is contamination and what isn't as we can. All right, now we're going to switch gears to fuel. So if you are worried, let's say, about a fuel system issue, I'm going to start off with a don't here. If you're worried about a fuel system issue, a good rule of thumb is don't use a solvent like a flush right before you sample, okay? I don't care if it's a flush that you added, a couple of oil changes ago. That is long gone, all right? And it doesn't take long for these solvent-based products to burn up and leave without, skewing the results at all, leaving behind unusual elements, impacting the physical properties, etc., etc. I'm talking about right before. You don't want to use a flush right before if you are particularly interested in fuel. Now, again, like, when we talk about switching to different brands or blends, quality product, it's going to work well. A flush, again, it's harmless. But if you have a flush that is impacting the flash point, how we detect fuel, and you're worried about a fuel system issue, well, it's going to be tough to say, all right, the flash point is such and such, temp. Okay, how much of that was caused by the solvent? How much was caused by fuel? Both of these things lower the flash point, and there you go. We have a cosmic gumbo of possibilities, and it's going to be tough to make any hard and fast calls. So if you're worried about a fuel system issue, try to avoid a flush. And if you do use a flush, again, it's not going to hurt anything, but you might want to hold off on assuming that a low flash point is your smoking gun if you're trying to, hunt down if there's a stuck or a leaking injector or a problem with a fuel pump or, so on. So just avoid it right before sampling if you're worried about a fuel system issue, or if you're monitoring, a fuel system issue. That's a good thing to do. Another thing, now this is not as strong of a don't. It's just a good rule of thumb, I would say. So again, if you do this for, a need or, just it was unavoidable. When you're changing the oil, you want to avoid just letting the engine idle to warm up if, again, you're worried about fuel. Because idling before starting the drain can result in fuel dilution, because only idling to warm the engine isn't always enough to cook off all the fuel needed for startup. So it's something to avoid. Again, I wouldn't say it's a firm don't, as in like, we simply won't be able to tell you what's going on. It's just a good thing to avoid. We know a typical amount of fuel that can come from normal use, so it's not as if, we're totally, incapable of determining anything having to do with fuel. It's that it's a good thing to avoid, just to give you as much clarity as possible. So avoid idling to warm the engine up if you can. Starting it briefly, the engine, and then starting the drain. That's another way for fuel dilution to be a factor. It's just something that I would rather not do, especially if I'm trying to focus in on fuel dilution and what could be evidence of a problem versus what is probably not. So again, minor amounts of fuel, they can show up from normal use, like idling to warm the engine or, sampling after briefly starting it, but something to avoid if you're worried about fuel. Now, let's say that we identify quite a bit of fuel, more than can come from normal use. We straight up, are calling it a problem, but maybe you have doubts on your end. Oil analysis can be new to so many people, and they might not quite pick up what we're putting down right away. So if we call out excess fuel and you're looking for ways to confirm it on your end as well, well, you can do that by either checking for a rising oil level on the dipstick, or you can also pay attention to how much oil you drain versus how much you put in. These symptoms on the owner's side are important because in addition to what we find, I think seeing is believing for so many people. Now, seeing is believing for us too, but in the building, we're so used to looking at these results and understanding what they mean that, we have an easier time looking at the numbers and understanding the gravity of the results. But when you're outside the lab, maybe you are still getting accustomed to oil analysis and trusting it the way in which an analyst will. So if you're looking for a way to confirm these things on your end, remember, check for a rising oil level. And, if it's a situation where we found just enough fuel to mention, it's not like you need to be checking that every time you shut off the engine, get under the hood and look at the dipstick. It's not to that degree. But if we point out a high level and you want to see some evidence on your side, those are two things you can do. And as with coolant, if we do find a lot of fuel, you're going to want to be conservative with your oil change intervals. Fuel, if it's excessive, can thin the viscosity significantly. It can dilute metals down, which kind of masks how the engine is wearing. So you want to be able to keep an eye on it. And again, you can verify problems on your end too, in addition to what we can find in analysis. It makes a convincing case when you have evidence on our side and yours as well. Now we go to our third and final topic for the do's and don'ts, and that is excess dirt, what to do, what not to do. If you're either wary of excess dirt being a problem, an issue with your air filter, or if we point out that there could be excess dirt, what to do next for your maintenance and what to do before you take another sample. So in testing, excess dirt can show up as high silicon. And if you're a longtime listener of the show, you might even need a refresher on this. Silicon has many faces, okay? It can come from a lot of different sources. And that's why, earlier towards the top of the show, I mentioned that I really like how in our reports, we don't just group elements together and only call them contaminants or only call them additives or metals. The fact is, some additives contain metals. Some additives contain what looks to be coolant. And some additives and products that you can use, such as sealers and lubes, some of those contain silicon. So you need to understand context, and you need to understand, what's been going on the owner side. We need the info regarding recent work in order to make direct conclusions, but we can point out the possibility and we can narrow it down and give you the information you need for your maintenance plan. So if we point out a high silicon level, what you should do next is look for points where dirt could be getting in, especially if it's not a situation where, if it's factory oil, there's bound to be high silicon just from sealers and lubes used at the factory. That's okay. But let's say you're not in the context of wherein you haven't done a recent rebuild, no modifications, it's not a new engine. If we point out a high silicon level, you want to rule out cracks or leaks along the intake plumbing, make sure there's no loose connections on the filter box. And if you find no way that dirt could be getting past the filter, then your likely sources of silicon are either a harmless sealer or lube, or it can come from the sampling method. So if you're sending in a sample and you're like, well, I recently fixed an intake leak, or I noticed my filter wasn't sealed properly, and now I'm I want to see if there's excess dirt. Well, pay attention to whether or not you've used any sealers or lubes recently, and also your sampling technique. If you did not take that sample straight from the drain, if you used a funnel, if you used anything as a middleman here, and you didn't just take the oil from the drain into the container that you sent to us for sampling, let us know, because there will be cases where it's pretty common to find a lot of silicon that's just merely introduced during sampling. There are cases where we can find a lot of silicon from recent use of a sealer or lube. Some oils even use silicon. One that uses more than most is Redline, just as an anti-foaming additive. Again, harmless, Redline, good product, but let us know if you're using it, because let's say you're running Redline, you don't let us know the oil type, and you're worried about an air filtration issue. Well, silicon can raise that possibility, but if we know the oil and we know the context, no recent work, nothing that would indicate a sealer or lube could be the explanation, well, then we have the clarity to give you the most likely explanation for where silicon is coming from. So again, if you find yourself in a situation where you are concerned there could be excess dirt, maybe you fixed an issue recently, it's pretty common for folks to say, hey, I live in conditions where there's just a lot of, debris in the air, or I recently had an issue where the filter wasn't properly seated. Let us know the surrounding context. If there's been no recent work, then we could have confidence in a high silicon level probably being from dirt, especially if you didn't use any silicone-based tools during your sampling process. And if we do point out that there is dirt contamination, that is very likely an issue, we can also tell you what sort of impact that is having based on the wear levels, especially in the cylinder area. If we're finding excess aluminum, chrome, and iron, and a high silicon level, then there's good reason to suspect dirt is causing poor wear in the cylinders. We can let you know the surrounding impacts. And of course, this applies to all contaminants. If we find fuel and we see that the additives are unusually low, we can speak to, whether or not the engine is probably wearing more than it seems, but fuel is diluting those metals. And coolant, of course, we'll look and see if usually it hits the bearings first. We'll tell you if it's causing poor bearing wear or poor wear anywhere else. If it's a cracked cylinder head, for example. And with excess dirt, we know the metals that tend to read high. And that's good information to have, even if you have a situation where, okay, there was a recent modification, but I'm still suspicious of excess dirt. Can you at least tell me if there's silicon reading high and what surrounding impact is it having? We can dig into those numbers and tell you if it appears that, hey, even in the instance of a recent repair, we wouldn't be so quick to assume silicon is just sealer because XYZ metal is high compared to our averages. Again, as with so many topics we cover on this show, I know it can be a lot to wrap your head around all these possible explanations and the ways in which certain elements can be from a variety of sources. It is a lot to unpack, but I do this episode because I want to let you know that we're aware of these varied explanations. We understand how to sift through the context and understand what the likely issue is. So really, all you have to do is let us know what's been going on your end. Keep a good record of modifications, repairs, oil change history, whether or not you're using any additives. And as long as you are keeping good records, or at least giving us the ballpark information, of course, you can have an instance where you recently made a new purchase and you don't know what the last owner did. That's okay. But usually, if you're able to provide recent history, on either repairs or the lack thereof or additives, you're going to be in a good spot. And we're going to be in a good spot to let you know what you need to do or not to do on your end. And as always, if you have any questions, if you need clarification before you send in a sample, our email is open. You can give us a call. So however you need to reach out, whether it's phone call, email, social media, do that. And we will be happy to let you know, hey, okay, you suspect this sort of problem. Maybe hold off on using a particular additive, or maybe, you might want to avoid using, a flush or a RevX or whatever it is. We'll be there to guide you on whether or not a certain product is likely to have or not have an impact on your results. And like I said at the top of the show, I'm so appreciative of the listener support. We see your notes on the oil slips, the emails you send along. Your support means the world. It keeps us going. We'll be back soon with episode 75, but that's all for today's show. This is Blackstone Joe, signing off.